Just out of curiosity, from my perspective, how many of you have used here, I'll just actually show it, but we'll talk about it in more depth. How many of you have used the selection basket to make selections in ACDSee? I'm curious about it because I feel like it's an underutilized tool, but oh, Barbara, you've used it a lot? Awesome. That's actually really cool to hear. Laurent, no. Has anyone else used it to any extent? No? Okay. Sigrid, no. Scott, no. Okay. So yeah, so one person uses it a lot and other people don't use it at all. So the selection basket's really powerful. At face value, what it does is it saves a selection. So we'll just make a quick selection right now. There's our quick selection, just using the rectangle tool here. And what the selection basket does is it enables us to take an active selection or an active mask. So in this case, an active selection or an active mask using these tools on the right here. And what that does is we can then turn it into a mask corresponding to whatever the selection was. So if I wanted to set this selection as a mask of the selected layer, so selected layer being layer one, right? With our now saved selection, I can turn it into a mask or I can turn it into an active selection, although right now it already is one, but I could go ahead and then mask in correspondence with that. Obviously, saving a selection of a rectangle is not very useful, but saving selections of either AI selections or manual made selections are very powerful, and it allows us to work with our subject matter and like actually make some really cool adjustments to our image. So we'll talk about that a little bit today, and we'll just look at some basic tools that we can use in order to make our subjects pop a little bit more. So I will disable this here, and we'll talk about that. So in my subject here, I have a woman in the foreground, and I have a background that is sort of already a slightly in blur. If I wanted to make a subject pop, there's a couple ways to do this. We can actually further we'll maybe look at a different image to illustrate this, but we can force blur a background, which will, by its very nature, draw our foreground into the center of attention. Or we can do the opposite of that, which is we can focus on making our foreground, or in this case, our center of focus, the subject matter in our image, more clear. More clear in terms of not only clarity, but also adjusting the lighting in our image to sort of get a best result. So how I would do this, in the past, before we had AI selections, I would go through the process of making a manual selection using the brush tool and a combination of smart brushing, which is obviously very labor intensive, and takes quite a bit of time because you're looking to make a selection of a subject, and sort of omit the background. This can be good to refine our selections if we need to. If we run into a situation where the AI wasn't able to fully perform a selection of the subject, we can go about adding our subject in after the fact using smart brushing. But for the most part, the AI is actually really good when it comes to subject selection, especially when in regards to people. So what we don't necessarily need to do is go through the process of a full manual selection anymore in the current version of the software. What we can do is we can go about using AI selections or AI actions here to perform a selection on our subject, and then we can sort of refine that if need be, depending on what the status of our subject is. So when we go to make a subject selection itself, okay, what it's going to do is it's going to promote an active selection. And this is, consider this basically a holding space, in that this selection, we haven't actually done anything to the selection yet. What we're going to do is we're going to make adjustments predicated on this selection. What the selection is asking us is to make some decisions on whether or not we like the selection or whether or not we want to adjust it further. And so when we have something like a select subject in this case, what we can do is, much like I've described, we can use manual brushing methods, or sorry, rather manual selection methods that are up at the top here to sort of add to or remove from our selection, provided, of course, that our selection needs refining. So we have the brush selection, which we can add to. We can use the shape selection tool, the rectangular selection tool, the elliptical, the lasso. Note that if we're using these things and we wanted to add something to our selection, so if I wanted to like zoom in on a part of my subject matter and I said, oh, okay, this looks great, but it didn't capture the hair very well, so I'm going to adjust that. Choosing a tool like this is really useful. Just note that we don't want to be completely resetting our selection. And so we have a series of tools up at the top here that allow to add or subtract from the selection. So adding to a selection, which is the plus button here, allows me to say, okay, well, there's an addition of content to my active selection. I've then added that, right? Versus using the subtract tool, which is right next to it here, would be to go through and then actually actively remove things from the selection. So when I go to commit that, it removes it. To be more specific, if I wanted to, let's just take away half of this. I'm just going to subtract half of my selection. That would look like this, right? So I'm taking away a portion of an active selection. Not useful for me, so I'm just going to undo that. But in this case, my subject matter is actually selected really well. The only thing that I want to maybe address is the fact that this section right here is an unnecessary selection because it's actually not a part of my subject here. It's a part of the background. So what I would do in this case is I think I'll probably just brush it out, honestly. I don't think the shape selection tool is that useful here just because it's pretty small. So I'll just illustrate how this works. So I have the brush selection here, and I have I'll turn smart brushing on. So I'm going to turn smart brushing on by clicking on this box here and going down to magic. So what smart brushing does is it allows us to take out contents of our image, but it does so by being a pixel aware. And so what it's looking for is it's looking for both a combination of texture and, or I guess brightness rather, and color. And it looks for similar pixels. So you'll see what that's going to look like in a moment here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right click instead of left click, and it'll be content aware of the space and only remove the color that I want. I'll probably have to do a bit of refining on the edges here, so I'll do that really quickly. But for the most part, that looks pretty good. Let's just take that in right there. So that's pretty good. This area in the hair is probably too small for us to worry about. Maybe I'll try. Yeah, that's not bad. And there's a little section up here that we'll maybe look to get rid of as well. So the point of this is, like I said, this I don't even need to do this. My selection is so good on my subject matter here, but I will go in and I'm just going to take those little components out. Unlike the polygonal selection or the rectangle or the lasso, when I use these tools, um, I so the polygonal selection, if I wanted to be additive, subtract, or make a whole new selection, I would set the corresponding button to that. The brush tool works a bit differently in that a left-hand click is an application, whereas a right-hand click, or sorry, right finger click is a removal. So when I went in, I was really just using my right mouse button to remove those sections of my selection. So I have a refined selection now. So it took my AI selection that I started with, and I've made a very, very simple and rudimentary sort of brush removal of an over selection or a part of my image that I have selected too much. From here, what we can do is we can use the selection basket. And I really I want to use that here because I think it's going to be useful to holding on to these valuable selections. When it comes to AI selections, that was a very fast process, but there might be certain selections, they might be manual selections, where this is going to be really useful because you might be spending more time producing a selection than not. And if that is the case, then it would be beneficial to have a saved version of that active selection. So in the selection basket itself, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this active selection of our subject matter here. Um, so just to get an understanding of how the selection basket works, is these buttons on the right are the ones that pull a save from your active image here. And the two methods by which you can pull a saved selection is by using, in this case, an active selection. So the red is, in this case, an active selection. Or alternatively, you can take a active mask and you can save that mask. And so the benefit of this is if you have a selection, you're going to save it and allows you to mask it properly. If you already have a mask, that's great, but maybe you want to actually turn that mask into an active selection, in which case you can further refine your image from there. So this just gives you a bit of flexibility and control and a little bit of cross application. So I can take something that is, in this case, a selection. I'll hit the selection button that adds it to basket. And then you'll see here that the selection that I have here really resembles a mask. And in ACDSee, masks and selections they rhyme in that selections are often what is informing a mask. Just quickly, I'm assuming most people know what a mask is because I see a lot of repeat names from previous workshops. But for the benefit and just a reminder, a mask is a tool that is used in image post processing that allows you to select or to make an isolation of a part of your image and then apply effects to that isolated space. And so a mask is an area of your image that you're telling the tool, the software in this case, to consider, right? Inversely, what you're telling the software to do by making a mask is to not consider, or rather ignore, the other parts of the unselected or unmasked part of your image. So to compare this, and I think this is a really good example image, my subject here is selected actively, as we can see that we can see that with the red here. And we can see that that red selection corresponds to my selection basket in that there's this white blotch in the center of this saved selection. That white blotch tells me a lot of information. So when it comes to masking, white is a binary application, or essentially like a turned on effect area, whereas the black is a sort of a binary ignore. It's treated as a sort of a space that we're not applying any adjustments to. So in this case, the white area of our image, when we go to make adjustments using adjustment layers, we'll see effects, whereas the black area will remain unchanged. So let's just deselect our subject now, just using Alt-D or the Select and Deselect panel. And that brings our subject back. And basically there is no longer an active selection in the space, which is fine. That's actually really useful. From here, because we've saved a selection basket, the sort of existential crisis of losing my selection is lessened. And the reason why is because instead of having to go through and to remake a selection, I can use my selection basket to inform a selection. So I can take this little guy right here and I could say, set this selection as a current selection. So turn it from a saved selection to an active selection. There you go. So if I wanted to refine the selection in any way, I could do that. And then I could predicate a new selection basket item based on any refinements that I've made. So number two is I can take this this selection here, and then I can set the selection as the mask of the selected layer. So what I can do is I can mask in correspondence, so correspondence with my subject matter. So now I have taken a active selection, I've turned it into a sort of selection basket item, and then I've masked in correspondence with that saved selection. So again, this is not new to ACDSee. I could have just set a mask of my image predicated on my active selection I had earlier. But I think one of the benefits when we're working with selections and we're making adjustments to our subjects is, especially because subjects can be quite complicated selections and often do require some refinement, it's better to go through the selection basket than to just like dump an application, a selection on our image without having saved it first and foremost. This gives me the ability to go back and forth and to use this selection as I see fit. Okay, so I set this aside for now. We'll come back to this later. But so we have our masked subject now. And earlier, when I was describing the subject selection basket here, um, the thing I mentioned was that the black portion is turned off, and the white portion is retained. And so how that applies to masks is if we look at our image layer here, you can see that our image layer still contains all of the contents that it did previously, but our mask is applying a change to our image. It's not doing anything destructive. We haven't erased the background in our image. Rather, we've just considered it out. So the black portion of our image is now represented by this checkerboard, which all that does is indicate to me that this part of my image is now a transparency, meaning it contains no pixel information. Whereas my subject matter is retained as per my selection, and it can be useful for further adjustments. Okay, Chuck asked a question, and then we'll continue. Chuck asked, is the selection in the basket good only for the photo being worked on, or can the objects in the basket be used on other photos? So that's a good question. Selection baskets are image specific. What that means is that if I go to a new image, it's going to have its own quotation marks selection basket. And provided that there isn't an active selection in the selection basket, it won't be retained. Here's the other thing about selection baskets that's worth noting is that selection baskets are not saved when we save this photo. Even if we save it non-destructively as an ACDSee file, this selection basket will be purged at the end of a session. So one thing that I always say to my users and people that are sort of new to ACDSee is don't fret about this. The reason why is because provided you have made adjustments to your image, you will already have masks on your image, in which case you can use those masks to then inform by clicking the add a currently selected layer mask to the basket. We can then inform that. So even if we had lost this quote unquote selection, I can take this mask that I have applied and I can actually turn it into the selection basket. So provided you're actually making adjustments to your image and you're not just saving selections that you plan on leaving, this is a really useful tool. Just note that, Chuck, it's sort of purged at the end of a session, and selection baskets are sort of image unique in that they are only treated for this particular image. And going into another image will have its own corresponding selection basket. Does that answer your question, Chuck? If so, let me know. Now, there is a way to save a selection. Just to give you an idea, that is image specific and will be retained on the image. It's not by using this selection basket though. It's actually saving the selection as metadata to your file. So this is a bit different. It's still very useful though. So here I have an active selection of my subject here. I'm just going to name it select subject. And in this case, even if I was to navigate away from my image here, I'll just save this really quickly. So we have a copy of it, subject select. So what I'm doing here is I'm saving my image to illustrate that save selection is something that is held onto outside of the file. I'm just going to save my image here as an ACDSee file, and this contains layers. So if I was to navigate away from this image here, I'll just navigate away. Here I'm back in manage mode here, and we'll go back into my clothing folder that contains this subject here. I saved active selection in this image, and I can load it using the load selection. But note that if I pull up the selection basket, that previous item that I had listed here has been purged, like I said, Chuck. Meaning that if I'm really, really keen on saving a selection, what I can do is I can load a selection that I've saved using the save selection tool right here. And then provided that I have an active selection, I can go through the process of adding it again to my basket. Keep in mind that I didn't necessarily need to do that because I also have a mask of my subject, which works, like I said, it rhymes with my selection. So I can just go through the process of adding a selection that way too. But the point is that Chuck asked, hey, is the selection basket, unique to only this image? The answer to that is yes. And when I go to save a selection, even though the selection basket is purged, I can save a selection if I need it. I can use that save selection tool. If I've already made adjustments to my image and I have a mask on my image with a selection that I like, I can also improve my basket by using those items too. Okay, so let's take a moment here and let's just remove this mask from our image here. And let's talk about some improvements to this image. So, this image is actually a really good example of one that I think would really benefit from a levels adjustment. So, when it comes to subject matter photography, I think, I mean, the three major players when it comes to adjusting lighting are exposure levels and curves. And this, I think, is a key example of a curve adjustment. So, where exposure would increase or decrease the overall light in your image, and levels would adjust the sort of midtones, highlights, and shadows. Curves kind of operates as a way to do really, really subtle adjustments of contrast that operate on a curve so that they have a natural sort of application rather than maybe a more egregious contrast adjustment. So what I can do is I'll add a curves adjustment, and you can see that this curves adjustment is applied wholesale to my image here, or rather it has a general application to my image here. But what I can do is I can use my selection basket to actually inform my layer, as I've mentioned previously. So if I click on the set this selection as a mask of the selected layer, I have then applied this selection to only the corresponding subject in the center of my image here. Did everybody see how that worked? I'll maybe just do a quick reset of this to showcase this. But all I did was go ahead and add a curves adjustment here. This curves adjustment, as you can see, is being applied to the whole image uniformly. But what I can do is I can take my selection basket item, and if I click on the mask button, so just quickly, the buttons that we see in the bottom is delete the selection, which will remove it from the selection basket. Set the selection as a current selection or active selection, which we've seen already. It does that. We can duplicate the selection, which will literally create a copy of it in the selection basket. And the last thing that we can do is we can set the selection that I have here, onto a currently selected layer. Now, I have selected my curves layer here, as you can see. So what it's going to do is it's going to apply this mask to the corresponding mask of the adjustment layer. That mask being indicated by this black or this white thumbnail box that we see here. So from here, now what we can do is we can adjust this curves as we see fit in a way that is gentle and has an application that is something that we like, versus something that is applied to the whole image wholesale. So what I've done here is I've made a classic S curve. So an S curve would be a very, very subtle application. What it does is it stabilizes the midtones, but allows a sort of more gradual application of the shadows, and it essentially darkens the shadows and amplifies the highlights. So the difference between the two in this case would look like this. Oh, sorry, would look like this. So this is the image before, and this is the image after. And then I've slightly reduced the opacity on this layer itself to just get a slightly gentler effect. From here also, we might do something like a clarity adjustment, which is going to create sort of like a sharper distinction between pixels. So I can apply a clarity. And if we just increase the clarity in my image, you probably have seen it, but you can see that it applies to texture quite well. Here's without. So without, it will smooth it out quite a bit. And with it, it will apply sort of a harsher application between pixels. If a subject has granular detail, in this case, our subject has a bit of freckles, a very gentle application of clarity will highlight those features. So what I'm going to do here is, once again, I'm going to use my selection basket, my active one. I will apply a mask to the clarity here, and then let's adjust accordingly. We don't need a full clarity application, but maybe just a little bit to make our subject pop a little bit there is going to be useful. The other thing that I would suggest too is any change to a white balance. So white balance in this case is going to either increase the temperature or decrease the temperature, or increase the tint or decrease the tint. So it kind of works by increasing the temperature, we make our image a little bit more golden in hue. And by sort of adjusting the tint and temperature, what we can do is we can correct for any overly blueness in our image, or vice versa, any overly magenta or green in our image. So what we do is we implant the opposite of the color spectrum, and that will take away those values. So if our image hypothetically was overly blue, we could increase the temperature in our image to accommodate for that. Vice versa, if our tinting was very magenta in our image, we would slide the slider slightly over into the green spectrum, and that would correct our image there. In essence, make our image closer to like what would be more of a natural light effect. Barbara asks, can you do adjustments using the filter menu? So yes, sort of. The filter menu is destructive, so I typically avoid it, but I can showcase, let me see, I can showcase how that would work. But I'm just going to finish this operation really quickly. So I have a white balance adjustment here. There's a before and after. Let's actually see what this looks like just on the subject alone. I'd be curious about this, because as you can see, when I turn it off, the background becomes quite blue. Yeah, but no, it actually draws a little warmth to the center of my image here. So that's awesome. So I have my white balance adjustment. I have a very subtle clarity adjustment, and then a standard S curve that I would apply to pretty much most images here. And the combination of the three, sorry, would look like a difference between, So this is our image before, which is a bit washed out, it's overly sitting in this saturated sort of center tone, midtones. It doesn't have a lot of contrast. So adding something like a curves adjustment adds a bit of visual contrast, adding a little bit of clarity makes the textures on my image pop a little bit, and then adjusting for white balance brings her in as the center focus because the other part of my images are really cool. Okay, Barbara asks, can you do adjustments using the filter menu? So, Barbara, just for your benefit and for the benefit of others, in edit mode, so unlike develop mode, where everything you're doing in develop mode is completely non-destructive, edit mode has a mixture of destructive and non-destructive capabilities. Typically speaking, how I like to describe these non-destructive capabilities are the ones that you see on the right-hand side here. This whole toolbar on the right-hand side that incorporates adjustment layers right here, layers themselves, and sort of like active selections. This is all non-destructive. And what I mean by that is that when you save this file, excuse me, when you save this file as an ACDSee file, I can come back to these adjustments in the future and address anything that I wanted to change. So if I navigate away from my image here, la di da, I'm over here in a different folder, and I come back to this image in the future. A noteworthy quality of adjustment layers is that the adjustments that I've applied are non-destructive. So if I'm looking at my white balance here, you can see that the same characteristics of that 14 adjustment is there. The clarity is slightly increased. The curves are there. And you can see that my opacity corresponds to the curves adjustment I made. So ultimately, what that is showcasing to me is that it is showcasing that these adjustments are um, are uh, are non-destructive, right? I've been able to see that I can make adjustments to them in the future. Okay, so versus the filter menu, which is on the left-hand side here. So the filter menu, broadly speaking, is destructive. So when I say that it is destructive, I mean that when we make an adjustment using the filter menu, it is done and it is not something that we can edit again. Um, Caveat to that, we can use layers to adjust the layer we've created, but the individual effects of, say, going into exposure and increasing the lighting value using the filter menu, I can't go in and say, hey, I'm going to move that value from 15 to 10, right? So filters are destructive. Your question is, can you do adjustments using the filter menu while, I guess in this case, preserving a selection? And that's a really good question. And the answer to it is yes. Here's how you would do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a filter adjustment. Let's use tone curves again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy my layer here. So I'm going to make a duplication of my layer here. I'll just move it to the top here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a mask. So I'm going to go to my, oops, I've closed my selection basket, but that's okay. I can pull this in and I'll use this selection. I'm just going to make a quick, let's make a quick selection of my subject here. And then what I'll do is I will bring this active selection. Okay, Barbara, I'm going to bring this into the tone curves tool in the filter menu. Provided that I have an active selection, tone curves will apply it to that active selection. So when I go to bring open the active selection here, you can see that that effect is only being applied to our subject. And if I wanted to, say, brush on this effect, I'll just, let's see here. Ooh, that's actually hard to showcase. How would I showcase this? Yeah, because I'm only seeing the active selection right now. That's not a great way to showcase that. I don't know how to explain that. Anyway, point is, I have an active selection here, and I can make a curves adjustment to my active selection. And as you can see, that applies to my subject here. So when I go to click done, that will be applied. And all I need to do is deselect my subject here. So that's what my subject now looks like predicated on that filter. Um, Now, there was one other thing. Uh, so you were interested in using the brush on a selection. So, that being said, all of that sort of description aside, keep in mind, Barbara, that once you have an active mask on an image, you can use the brush tool over the mask in the same way that you would be using it in a filter. So not a lot of point of using a filter in that case if you just want to get a brush effect, because we can go in and we can adjust this white balance to say, let's have this white balance also apply to everything but the skyscrapers in the background here. So I would use my brush tool in combination with my white balance thumbnail here. So what I would do is I'd make sure I'm clicking on the mask, and then all I would do is just paint on that effect in the areas that aren't our subject. So while you can use the filter menu to do that, more importantly, you could just use the mask to non-destructively do that as well. So what I've done here is I've painted on white on the bottom, and you can see that that white balance has now been applied to the bottom, and that's verifiable on the mask itself. The mask simply tells me that that white balance has been applied to the bottom there. Whereas in maybe a filter, you would be using your eye to see that that was the case. Does that make sense, Barbara? If so, let me know. So there is a way of doing what you've described, and hopefully that showcases it. The benefit of using a filter is that some of these tools have really, really refined adjustments that you can only get within the filter menu. So there might be a benefit to doing some certain lighting or color adjustments. For example, like tone wheels isn't even available in the layer panel, the adjustment layer panel. So there is ways to apply that. What else is there to talk about today? So just a summary of what we've talked about. We put a lot of emphasis on just describing how selections are done, and then looking at adding to selections using manual functions. So we started by creating a AI selection of our subject here in the image. And then what we did is we refined it with the brush selection tool, although you can also refine it with all these other selection tools. So when we've created that refinement, right, we've now spent time on our selection. And if we've spent time on our selection, we should utilize the selection basket because it enables me to quickly and efficiently reference that selection that I've made. So once again, the selection basket is under select and it's under selection basket. And this is the one that we created and we're using consistently. Some Chuck asked earlier, really good question. How do I preserve a saved selection on my image? And the way to do that, unlike the selection basket, which will be purged at the end of a session, you can save selection directly to the image by using the Save Selection tool, which essentially saves the selection to the metadata. And then you can load that selection next time you open up your session. The other thing that we mentioned too in regards to save selection baskets is that the selection basket rather is image specific. So I can't just take this selection basket and use it in another image. It has its own selection basket and is session based, right? And then lastly, just from a standpoint of making our subject pop, when we talk about our subject matter itself, we can focus on two things. We can focus on blurring the background, or we can focus on highlighting the foreground. And in this example, we've chosen to highlight the foreground. So how we did that is by applying a curves adjustment with our subject in mind using the selection that we've created. We created a clarity adjustment that is going to not only highlight the texture in our image, but sort of highlight any extreme points between pixels with really low brightness and really high brightness. And then we added a sort of a subtle white balance to our subject matter. And then for Barbara's benefit, we actually added it to the bottom of our image here as well to sort of, I guess in that case, it sort of justifies the color space, not only from the subject matter of our image, but also to the background. Before I finish up this workshop, I also want to showcase the inverse of what we've done. So I'm going to see if I can find an image that has a fairly substantial in focus background, and we can look about blurring the background slightly to emphasize our subject matter. I think this one might be a, no, that has a sort of a, already has a blurred background. Let's see if I can find one that will be appropriate, or we can just emphasize by blurring further as well. Ooh, this might be a good one. Let's see. Not particularly either. Okay, that's fine. All of these are well taken photos, so they're not very flat in appearance. But let's just go into an image, for example, and we'll showcase the inverse of what we just did here to illustrate it. So if I wanted to take my image here, what I would do, if just to provide a sort of inverse selection of it, is I would select the background in my image, not the subject. And this would be a one where I might also want to refine the selection as I've described. And instead of using something like the blur background like this, which doesn't allow us necessarily to directly control, we can just go into the blur tool and it'll add it as a sort of a mask. And from there, what we can do is we can increase the blur, or what we can do is we can use this selection once again to inform our saved selection basket. So I have this mask now, and so what I can do is I can reference this mask and I can apply further adjustments. For example, if I wanted to make a curves adjustment to the background, I could add a curves adjustment and then apply the mask and adjust accordingly. So now I have a blurred background that has a bit better curve to it and a little bit more emphasis on the shadows and the background, or the shadows and the highlights. So the difference between the two would be, okay, our base image here, again, quite flat. And then we've blurred, increased the blur of the background. And then we've also gone in and we've added a curves adjustment. So when we're making our subjects pop, provided that we already don't have, I mean, in this case, the example has a bit of a blurry background already, but we could just further emphasize by blurring that. Or what we could do is we could always highlight the subject matter by uh, by further emphasizing it using the adjustments that we talked about earlier, like the curves adjustment, the clarity adjustment, and adjusting any further issues like something like white balance. So hopefully that gives you an idea of looking at, this would have been a better photo to choose now that I think about it. But now that we have an idea of it, again, it's about selecting our subject. In this case, selecting our subject. If we need to refine the selection or image, which in this case we certainly would, the hair isn't captured on the right here, we would go through the process of refining using the selection tools and then adjusting accordingly after we've gone through the process of saving it to the selection basket. Those are the tools that I sort of really recommend when it comes to making your subjects pop. It's more than just an using like your adjustment layer tools and lighting adjustments. It's also a whole workflow that allows you to quickly reference these tools, which allows you to then streamline your workflow and make sure that you're making the exact same selection every single time. That sort of covers what I wanted to talk about today. Just a quick 50-minute workshop today. Does anyone else have any other questions that they'd like to ask or anything that you're curious about? I have a bit of extra time at the end of this workshop, so if anyone has anything that they'd like to cover, I'm happy to talk about that. But for all intents and purposes, we are done today. Thank you so much for participating, and I'll upload this to our YouTube within the next couple days so that people can see it there. But yeah, I'll stick around for a sec here and maybe actually edit this while I'm in the process of selecting it. If anyone has any questions, just let me know. Thanks, George. Jim, I'm so glad that was useful to you. Thanks for participating. Barbara, thank you. Good question, by the way. That was really, really good question. I find that people often get confused with the filter menu and the difference between the filter menu and the adjustment layer menu because they often have a lot of similar tools. Laurent, thank you so much. Thomas, thank you so much. Sigrid, thank you. Appreciate everyone participating today. Chuck says, I was trying to delete objects that I had converted to black and white. I couldn't make them select. Is that correct? You're trying to delete objects that you converted to black and white. Like while you're editing the image or like while you're managing the image, Chuck? I'm assuming based on the fact that you're talking about selections, it's while you're editing the image. Okay, so your photo was converted and then I wanted to delete some objects. And the issue was that you couldn't make a selection in the image. That's quite interesting. Um, yeah, okay, so it wouldn't let you make a selection. Was it letting you do any editing at all? Just out of curiosity. When you opened up the image, could you use like adjustment layers? You could apply all these general applications, but you couldn't apply them as a selection. This is strange, is what I'm talking about, but I'm just trying to sort of understand the issue. Oh, so you were able to select objects. So, oh, you weren't able to. I see, I see. Okay. So you were able to make general applications, but you weren't able to make any selections. Um, hmm. That's like approaching bug territory because I've never heard of it, especially if you've been able to open up an image. If an image won't open, it won't allow you to edit it at all. Just out of curiosity, if the image was black and white, let me see something. Sometimes if I wasn't, I was able to select if I did so before converting. Okay, okay. When what? And just out of curiosity, what did you just converted it to a black and white image? Okay. And what was the just out of curiosity, what was the incentive to do that rather than just you probably had a bunch of images you wanted to convert in bulk rather than just editing using the black and white or just desaturating your images or something like that in or using the black and white tool in ACDSee or in edit mode? Because some odd stuff happens when you convert your images. So I think if you were able to edit the original, which then it just means to me that the benefit there would be, okay, I know that I can edit this, so why don't I just pull it into edit mode, use the black and white tool, and then be able to select from there rather than the conversion process. Um, but who knows? Did you had to convert like 1,000 files or something? Like, was it like you needed to convert a bunch? Yeah. I yeah, if that's the case, then there is something that is happening in that conversion process that's changing the editing process. What you could do, okay, so let's say, for example, you no longer have this file anymore, the original, so you can't reference it. If you have a black and white image, what you can do is you can go into view mode and you should be able to use tools, modify, convert, change color depth, and you should be able to change it to a true color image. And if you change it to a true color image, it might be editable after that. Either that or I would go back to the original and um work off of the original. But it sounds like something's happening in the conversion. I'm assuming this is how you converted the color scape. You converted it to black and white in using this tool. Is that correct, Chuck? Or did you use something else?